Welcome back. History 1122, second half of Western Civ. We're going to talk about European exploration here at some length. We talked about Columbus and in detail. We talked about his pitch and the maps he used and the Columbian Exchange. I want to look in a little more detail at this fundamental shift in not only Western civilization, but in world history as well, as the Europeans begin to venture out across the Atlantic and then the Indian and Pacific Oceans and establish little Europes around the world. So let's talk about context first. Globalization, this is really the beginning of it. We've seen East and West meet before. The Silk Roads linking China to the Mediterranean. Alexander linking Greek culture to Persia. We see it with the Mongols, unifying good portions of Eurasia, creating a vast circuit of trade and travel. But here, this is true globalization in the sense that the entire Atlantic basin is now going to be tied together in this vast circuit of trade, and then the efforts will be made successfully to reach the Pacific and all the way to the Far East. Another context, in 1453, is the Muslims overrun Constantinople. What had been a Christian city for centuries is now a Muslim capital, and of course it's now called Istanbul. After this, trade between Christian Europe and the East tends to diminish severely. I think we mentioned the Muslim middleman in a few lectures ago. The rise of these Islamic kingdoms of the Middle Ages, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire, which prohibits trade, and of course is one of the reasons that Columbus decided to sail west to go east to avoid these Islamic kingdoms. So these are some big contexts, some significances. New Europes are established around the world in various temperate zones, both in the Western Hemisphere, Asia, and otherwise. And of course we have the dispersal or the dissemination of Christianity and Western culture around the world as well. I think it's important to note that Columbus set in motion forces that he could not possibly have grasped. Let's face it, Columbus went to his grave believing that he was scooting along the periphery of Asia and China, never believing that he had discovered a quote-unquote new world. So with Columbus and then those European explorers who followed him, I think of them as sort of the vanguard of European civilization, bringing technology, Christianity, disease, domesticated plants and animals, et cetera, and taking it throughout the world. So here, again, Western civilization tends to merge with world history. Upon returning to Spain after that first trip, that first voyage, Columbus wrote a letter for the court, for the king and queen. This letter, because of the invention of the printing press about a half century before, this letter became rapidly disseminated throughout Europe, and it became sort of the founding document of European exploration. Columbus was very optimistic in this letter, discussing precious metals, Christian converts, just a variety of things that he had found in the New World. So this letter becomes a sort of a bestseller and is an inspiration to other explorers. News of Columbus's discoveries spread throughout Europe as a result of the printing press. The Pope issues a papal bull that grants Spain all land discovered by Columbus. And of course, he does this in part for the spread of Christianity and of course for the discovery of gold. Shortly thereafter, the Treaty of Tordesillas will be created, dividing these new discoveries between Spain to the west and Portugal to the east. This line will be moved so that Portugal can lay claim to its colonies in Brazil. And of course, you have to also realize that once the Europeans, after Columbus, realize that they can grow commodity crops in the New World and make fortunes from these crops, that there has to be a vast labor force to do this. And since the indigenous people are in large part wiped out, Africans now become the laboring force in the form of slaves. So let's think about factors here in European expansion. These ancient maps are rebirthed during the Renaissance, and Europeans are getting a look at these world maps from antiquity. There are travel accounts that are made available. We've talked about Polo at some length. We talked about Sir John Mandeville. There's a letter written by a legendary character, Prester John, whose location continues to sort of shift about from Central Asia to Ethiopia. Prester John was perceived in the European minds as a potential Christian ally against the Muslims. There is an Italian merchant community that's familiar with China. Again, we go back to Polo. We have better technology, better maps, better compasses, astrolabes so that we can negotiate. Of course, the Mongol trade circuit still exists in the memory of many people. And in addition, another factor for European expansion is the old ideology of the Crusades. The Crusades led Western Christian noblemen to go to the Middle East to reclaim the holy sites there for Christianity. Again, this is another example of East and West commingling. Now, what I want to do for the rest of this semester is talk about three historians and their arguments regarding European expansion. The first is Alfred Crosby's book, Ecological Imperialism. If you go to graduate school in history, there's an excellent chance you'll read this book. It's very interesting. His argument in brief is that little Europes are now going to be scattered around the world in these temperate zones where European culture can flourish, like Australia or Argentina or New Zealand and other places. So I'm just going to sort of briefly go through Crosby's argument here to give you some sense of this book. He says that Europeans live in large numbers and in national units from the Atlantic to the Pacific, both north and south of the equator. He says that these Europeans establish new Europes in lands that are thousands of miles from Europe itself. He points out that Australia's population is almost entirely European, as the Aborigines have been destroyed. New Zealand, too, mostly European population. He talks about the fact that the vast majority of the population of the Western Hemisphere is European in origin, especially in North America. He talks about the fact that Uruguay and Argentina are nearly 100% of European descent. And then he asks, what do these little Europes, these new Europes, have in common? Well, he says they export very large quantities of food. Keep this in mind. Where are these Neo-Europes? Well, we mentioned a couple of places. Geographically, they're scattered, but they are in similar latitudes. They're located in the temperate zones, north and south. So they have similar climates. This is interesting. The regions that today export more foodstuffs of European preference, that is grains and meats, 500 years ago had no wheat, no barley, no rye, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, whatsoever. Again, Europeans took their culture with them, took their domesticated plants and animals with them, and then recreated these European cultures around the world. Crosby points out that the Americas were, in prehistory, as rich in large animals as the Old World. But, and this is true in Australia and New Zealand as well, but most of these large land animals in the Western Hemisphere and in the Southern Hemisphere have been wiped out at the end of the Pleistocene era about 13,000 years ago. This is the end of the Ice Age, the last Ice Age. It's believed, of course, that Homo sapiens, having arrived at these distant places, Western Hemisphere, Australia, New Zealand, South America, wiped out the large mammals for food and clothing. So you have mass extinctions here at the end of the Pleistocene. Crosby points out something else that's interesting. He says that in Eurasia, Homo sapiens and these large mammals had lived in close proximity for many, many centuries, and the animals had learned how to avoid humans and understood the danger that humans posed. He makes the argument that in these places where humans migrated much later, Australia, New Zealand, Western Hemisphere, that the extinction events occurred because the animals had not had time to learn the danger that man posed. So these animals were hunted down and slaughtered in great numbers and eliminated. So this is sometimes called the Pleistocene megafauna extinction. Pleistocene referring to the end of the last ice age, mega, large, fauna referring to animals, and extinction. It coincides with human migration, so you can draw your own conclusions. So that's Alfred Crosby's argument. It's very provocative, and it has great explanatory power. I want to spend a few moments talking about a much more popular book, one you may have even read. It was on the bestseller list. It's Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. His argument in brief is that Europeans had distinct advantages in spreading little Europes around the world. He asks a basic question: why did the Europeans reach out and conquer the lands of North America, South America, instead of vice versa? Diamond starts with a comparison of these societies, Old World and New World, in 1492. He says that the largest population replacement of the last 13,000 years has been the one resulting from the recent collision of the Old World with the New World, and then the dramatic shift in population to the New World. He says in Eurasia there were advantages because of the domesticated animals providing energy, food, clothing, etc. So there's an enormous set of differences here between the Old World and the New World with regard to what's available for domestication, plants and animals. Diamond reiterates the argument that the Pleistocene extinction gave the Eurasians and Europeans, gave them a great advantage over the societies of the Western Hemisphere, and makes the point, speculative point, that had Homo sapiens not wiped out the large mammals of the Western Hemisphere, that things might have been quite different in history. Diamond also points out that the Americas had two empires, the Aztecs and the Incas, which resembled European empires in size and sophistication, in diversity, religions. But these were the only two really large states in the Western Hemisphere. The only two capable really of making war on a large scale or having the capital and the manpower to create grand architecture. He points out that in Europe, Diamond says, well, you have Spain and Portugal, England, France, Holland, Sweden, and Denmark, all capable of creating and sustaining large-scale colonial enterprises. He said in the rest of the Western Hemisphere, besides the Aztecs and the Inca, you have societies organized on a much smaller level, a tribal basis, small bands of people working together. He also points out, Diamond points out, that Eurasians had literacy. They could read and write, and this will give them a great advantage. Their bureaucracies were much more sophisticated than that of the New World. Writing empowers European societies by facilitating political administration, economic exchanges. Writing, of course, motivates people to go out and discover these new worlds, seeking fame and wealth. So Eurasian societies enjoyed big advantages over Native American societies in food production and deadly pathogens, and technology, including metallurgy, organization, writing, on and on and on. And this is at the core of Diamond's argument. Diamond also makes the argument that in Eurasia, geographically, Eurasia is oriented east and west, so that plants and animals can move across this vast landmass and remain in a similar climate zone. He says, look at the New World, or look at the Western Hemisphere. where the geography is oriented north and south, and that as animals try to move north and south, they encounter many different climate zones, which inhibits their movement. So this is another factor. Now, finally, our last book here. This is a recent book. It's called A Brief History of Humankind. It's by Yuval Harari, I believe a professor in Jerusalem. His argument, to put it briefly, is that European curiosity and the admittance of ignorance was the key to European expansion and dominance. He says that both the European scientist and conqueror began by admitting ignorance, by simply saying that they don't know. They don't know what makes this work. They don't know what's out there. And therefore, they both felt compelled, both scientists and explorer, to go and make these discoveries, to find out about the New World, hoping this knowledge would make them masters of the world. You might remember when Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, he not only took his army with him, but he took a couple of hundred scholars with him as well. They founded an entirely new discipline, Egyptology, made important contributions to religion and linguistics, botany. In 1831, the Royal Navy sent the Beagle to do some map making in southern South America, the Falkland Islands and the Galapagos Islands. And of course, Charles Darwin accompanied this ship. And the results of this are a paradigm shift in human history, the emergence of natural selection over creationism. We see the Europeans begin to make maps and to begin to acknowledge blank spaces, places that they do not know what is there. We see them using their imagination, trying to fill in these blank spaces at times. So Harari makes the argument that these empty maps are sort of a psychological breakthrough for Europeans, a clear admission that they were ignorant of large parts of the world, and ignorance, of course, in this case, spurs the initiative to go find out what the world consists of. Harari says for thousands of years, not only the greatest thinkers and scholars, but also the infallible scriptures had known only Europe, Africa, and Asia. How could all of the experts been wrong? How could the Bible have missed half the world? Harari makes an interesting point here about Amerigo Vespucci, who we've already talked about, the Italian sailor who sailed down the Atlantic coastline of Brazil at the turn of the 15th century. He says, and I quote, "There is poetic justice in the fact that a quarter of the world and 2 of its 7 continents were named by Martin Waldseemüller, who we talked about in our discussion of Columbus's maps, that he named them Amerigo in honor of Amerigo Vespucci, who, unlike Columbus, came back to Europe and said, look, we thought we knew what was out there, but we do not. We're in for some big surprises here. The first big surprise, that those are not the Indies. That has to be a continent because a river the size of the Amazon could not be born of an island. It had to be born of a continent. So I want you to think of the European age of exploration and the scientific revolution running parallel, hand in hand. And once these new lands are established, there's great competition between the Europeans to reach them, to establish authority over them, to colonize them. This requires rapid acquisition of knowledge in just a wide variety of areas. So the age of exploration, the scientific revolution are running hand in hand. They have to gather enormous new data about geography, about climate, plants and animals, languages, cultures, on and on and on. And again, the old sources of authority are of little use here. The Bible has nothing to say about any of this. So you can see how Western civilization is rapidly becoming more and more sophisticated and expanding worldwide, so that Western Civ becomes, in part, world history at the same time. Thank you.